Here we go again. Postmodernism. Section 4. What are the key characteristics of postmodernism? Most worldviews state and defend their basic assumptions about reality. Postmodernists, though, try to position their thinking as a way to see through other worldviews, not as a worldview itself. Postmodernism dismisses the truth claims of other worldviews by focusing on how language is used to create and maintain the structures of society. Some postmodernists, such as Jacques Derrida, focus on deconstructing language to diminish its ability to persuade us that dominant truth claims actually represent truth. Others, Ludwig Wittgenstein and J.L. Austin, for example, analyze speech acts to show that there is no necessary relationship between a description and what is being described. In other words, a thought about a Ferrari and the Ferrari itself are related only incidentally. Thoughts are thoughts, and things are things. Other philosophers, like Edmund Husserl, have responded to this way of thinking by pointing out that thoughts are not just random, they are about things, and they are intended to be about things. The thought has certain properties, and so does the object of the thought. These properties are part of the nature of the thought and of the thing. How Husserl communicates this sounds complicated, but it is important. This is what he says: that a representation refers to a certain object in a certain manner is not due to its acting on some external independent object, directing itself to it in some literal sense, or doing something to it or with it, as a hand writes with a pen. It is due nothing that stays outside of the presentation, but to its own inner peculiarity alone. A given presentation presents this object in this manner in view of its peculiarly differentiated presentational characteristics. In other words, I'm glad there's an in other words. Objects and thoughts have qualities that present themselves consistently, no matter who is thinking about them. If someone says A and you hear B, it is not because A has no essence, but because you either aren't paying attention or are being ornery. We recognize that this is an introductory text and that we're already wading in some pretty deep water, so let's look at each piece of postmodernist philosophy one at a time. Language. Not everyone thinks in the same way or about the same things, but everyone uses language. Edward Sapir wrote in 1921, "There is no more striking general fact about language than its universality. One may argue as to whether a particular tribe engages in activities that are worthy of the name of religion or of art, but we know of no people that is not possessed of a fully developed language. The lowliest South African bushman speaks in the forms of a rich symbolic system that is in essence perfectly comparable to the speech of the cultivated Frenchman." To the postmodernist, language is the best starting point, then, for trying to describe human experience. No matter where you live, language shapes the way you think, and those who have a greater command of the language are able to think more accurately. For example, a computer programming expert with a larger vocabulary of technical words is able to think more precisely about computer programming than a novice. But, according to Sapir, language does more than just shape our thoughts. It actually shapes our approach to life. Peculiar modes of pronunciation, characteristic turns of phrase, slangy forms of speech, occupational terminologies of all sorts. These are so many symbols of the manifold ways in which society arranges itself and are of crucial importance for the understanding of the development of individual and social attitudes. Given the central role of language, one group of philosophers in the early 1900s argued that we should build our philosophy around language and relationships rather than around the nature of physical existence itself. This movement was called structuralism. Instead of focusing on scientific facts, structuralists look at how the way we use languages or language causes us to view facts differently based on our experiences. So, for example, people who live in a rainforest climate probably have words allowing them to more clearly describe different kinds of rain, whereas Eskimos presumably have more terms to describe snow. Structuralists aren't as interested in learning about rain or snow as they are interested in learning about how we talk about rain and snow based on our experiences. Post-structuralism. While structuralism was the starting point for many postmodernists, postmodernism itself is generally regarded as post-structuralist because postmodernists see their thoughts about language as moving beyond how it functions to its use. Postmodernists think we cannot know the world directly. We only know it as we interpret it. Since our language structures our relationships, our talk about the objects in the world isn't really about these objects at all. It's really about ourselves. So to use the previous example, when the rainforest natives talk about rain and Eskimos talk about snow, they aren't really talking about rain or snow, but about themselves, what they think is important about the weather and why. When your friend says, "There is a chair," he is not so much commenting on the chairness of the chair as he is making a statement about his own understanding of objects like chairs, about he himself is not the chair and how he thinks you should view the world similarly. As the German philosopher Martin Heidegger famously said, "The unitary fourfold sky and earth, mortals and divinities, which is stayed in the thinging of things, we call the world. In the naming, the things named are called into their thinging. Thinging, they unfold world, in which things abide, and so are the abiding ones. By thinging, things carry out world." What does that mean? Is Heidegger suggesting that things don't actually exist until we name them? No. He's implying that things only take on meanings as they become subject to our understanding through communication. It's a similar point to the one the sophist Gorgias made centuries ago. We will critique this view later in this chapter and throughout this book, but you can imagine how exciting this way of thinking seemed to philosophers. It gave birth to whole new sets of questions crying out to be answered. How exactly do we use communication to structure our world? How do different communities and language groups understand the world differently? How is it possible that people's way of thinking in one culture makes complete sense to them but to no one else? And perhaps the trickiest question of all, how do people use language to get others to do what they want? George Orwell's concern about the use and misuse of language George Orwell's concern about the use and misuse of language to create dictatorial power led him to write 1984, in which he chillingly described newspeak, a way of changing language to limit the range of expression and thus to limit thought. In one sense, Sim is lecturing her co-worker Winston, the main character, about newspeak's virtue. Sim says, "You haven't a real appreciation of newspeak, Winston. Even when you write it, you're still thinking in old speak. I've read some of those pieces that you write in the Times occasionally. They're good enough, but they're translations. In your heart, you'd prefer to stick to old speak with all its vagueness and its useless shades of meaning. You don't grasp the beauty of the destruction of words. Do you know what newspeak is? The only language in the world whose vocabulary gets smaller every year? Don't you see that the whole aim of newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it." If language structures how people think about things, then by eliminating certain words from usage and promoting other words, we can change the way people think. Now that's power. And this power is precisely what the post-structuralists were reacting against. Post-structuralists have moved beyond structuralism, the consideration of how language structures our interactions, in agreeing instead that language is primarily a tool of oppression, which the powerful use to impose ideas on everyone else. Deconstruction. In the 1950s, the world was still reeling from the ways brutal dictators manipulated language to create cultural hegemony. And hegemony would be the way the ruling class dominates society by shaping its values and beliefs. Let's go back to that sentence. In the 1950s, the world was still reeling from the ways brutal dictators manipulated language to create cultural hegemony, commit violence, and exclude the views of those with whom they disagreed. Philosophers like Michel Foucault, Jean Baudrillard, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-Francois Lyotard, we're going to assume they're all French, but I don't know if they were, but I can't say their names. They began looking for clues as to how dictators pulled it off, and they found themselves dismayed at the way modernism, supposedly rational and objective, had become an element of control in the hands of those with ill intent. As we've already mentioned briefly, Jacques Derrida in particular tried to show through his writings how texts of all kinds could be deconstructed to reveal their underlying assumptions and ideologies. Literature professors across the world had fun showing students how to ferret out a text's hidden or multiple meanings, polysemy. In the end, the reader's interpretation of the text became more important than the meaning of the author intended to communicate, since, strictly speaking, there was no meaning in the text itself. There couldn't be. Thoughts and things did not have essences that were consistently identifiable. Your experiences with something in the world cannot be generalized so that others' experiences of it can be said to be the same. In 1968, Roland Barthes wrote a short essay titled The Death of the Author. In this essay, he argued that the origin of the text is not the important thing. Rather, it is the destination, the reader. By allowing the reader to invent new meanings, the text is freed from the tyranny of the author's single intended meaning. For example, there is no reason to assume that a Shakespearean play means exactly the same thing today as it did when first performed. Each author or artist is the product of her own cultural setting and uses language to describe her interpretation of her own situation. Our situation is different, so our interpretation will obviously be different, as will the language we use to describe it. Thus, postmodern literary criticism claims that words cannot be known to accurately describe objects in the world. Words are about words, not about things. No matter how a writer constructs a sentence, it can never tell us about the real world, only about the world as the reader understands it. This concept is summed up in the phrase, "That's just your interpretation." Subjectivity. One of the ways postmodernists think language functions as a tool of power in the modern world is by establishing meta-narratives. A meta-narrative is a unifying story about the world that aspires to explain everything as if from a God's-eye viewpoint. Meta-narratives become so powerful that people who embrace them literally cannot imagine the world being any other way. Understanding the persuasive power of meta-narratives, postmodernists say, is the key to uncovering their secret power and freeing ourselves from their grip. It's easy to imagine how this way of thinking leads to a denial of universal objective truth. Let's say you lived in a country where every time people gained freedom, they used it to do horrible things to others. If someone arrived on your shores proclaiming, "Freedom is good, support more freedom," you would probably be suspicious. This person wants freedom because he intends to do horrible things to us. If you then traveled to another country where freedom was cherished as the basis of a good society, you'd probably be conflicted. How would you resolve this conflict? Most people resolve it not by recognizing that freedom is a good thing when properly understood, but by viewing freedom as neither good nor bad except when the situation makes it so. This is called subjectivity. Subjectivity is what Jean-Francois Lyotard had in mind in his famous statement about incredulity towards meta-narrative. To Lyotard, broad explanations are arrogant. They deserve suspicion because people's experiences are so varied, and people's experiences, not general statements about the world, are what we should be paying attention to. Even as you read this book, postmodernists would say you are not really learning to understand the world as it actually is. You are merging the concepts you're learning about into both your experiences and your culture's influence on you. We cannot know whatever real world is out there, they say. Strictly speaking, there are 7 billion interpretations of the world because each person on the planet sees the world based on his or her own subjective experiences and culture. Occasionally, you'll hear postmodernists use the term anti-realism to describe this suspicious approach to the so-called real world. So for postmodernists, capital T truth cannot be known directly. There are only truths, small t, that are particular to a society or group of people and are limited to individual perception. Written or verbal statements can reflect only a particular localized culture or individual point of view. A catchphrase we often hear is, "That may be true for you, but not for me." Yet by making the universal statements that there are no meta-narratives, haven't postmodernists actually created a meta-narrative of their own? The story that all universal truths are false, that there are only local stories told by various cultures, is itself a story of the world. In some ways, postmodernism is the anti-worldview worldview. But can we understand it well enough to predict how postmodernists will view any given situation or academic discipline? This is the question we will tackle next.